Oh, thank you. What an unexpected surprise. Thank you. Well, hello. My name is Steve Szynski. I'm chairman of Cal Poly's President Cabinet, and good afternoon to all of you. For 3 decades, Warren and Carly Baker have brought together the President's Cabinet, a group of business, industry, government, and community leaders, all of whom share 2 things in common: their passion for Cal Poly and the respect and admiration for the Bakers' leadership of this fine university over the past 31 years. The President's Cabinet surprised the Bakers in 1999 with an endowment that provides sustaining support for a public policy forum for leaders from education and industry. In presenting this endowment to the Bakers, we proposed that their name be associated with this gathering, that it be called the Baker Forum, to recognize their contributions to Cal Poly, but also to help ensure the success of the forum in attracting senior leaders for significant exchanges of ideas. The purpose of the Baker Forum is to foster a conversation about the important role that a Polytechnic, science, and technology universities play in our world today, and to invite creative thinking about ways in which it can be strengthened into the future. The 2010 Baker Forum has brought together leaders from education, industry, and government to discuss the multiple dimensions of innovation and implications for Polytechnic universities. We're starting this afternoon with a public keynote address by Walter Moos, Vice President, Biosciences Division, SRI International. In a few moments, he's going to share information and perspectives regarding the role that innovation plays in the pharmaceutical industry and the critical place the industry occupies in the 21st century. Tomorrow, forum participants will continue the dialogue and conversation and seek to identify ways in which Cal Poly can promote innovative habits of thought and practice among graduates, promote applied research responsive to the needs of California's economy, and support innovation more broadly in California and the nation. Before I invite Dr. Moos to come forward, I would like to say a few words about his background, and it is impressive. Walter Moos joined the Not-Profit Research Institute, SRI International, in 2005 as Vice President of its Biosciences Division. At SRI, he leads a unique pharmaceutical team of more than 200 people with all the resources necessary to take research from initial discoveries to the start of human clinical trials. SRI Biosciences is an integrated R&D organization carrying out basic research on disease mechanisms like a university, performing drug discovery like a biotech venture, and providing preclinical services like a contract research organization. From 1997 through 2004, Dr. Moos was chairman and CEO of Mitocore, now called Migenics. From 1991 through 1997, he was a vice president of R&D at Chiron, now Novartis. From 1982 to 1991, he rose to the level of vice president at Park Davis Pharmaceutical Research Division of Warner Lambert, now Pfizer, I believe the youngest vice president in that company's history. He has held adjunct faculty positions at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor and has been an adjunct full professor since 1992 at the University of California, San Francisco, and since 2007 at James Madison University. He has also served on a variety of academic, government, and other advisory committees. Dr. Moos has edited 5 books, founded multiple scientific journals, and has about 150 published manuscripts and patents. He holds degrees from Harvard University and the University of California, Berkeley. Please, all of you, join me in giving a warm welcome to 2010 Baker Forum speaker, Dr. Walter Moos. Take it away.
Thank you, Steve, and good afternoon. It is both a pleasure and an honor to have the opportunity to speak with you today. The title, as Steve just mentioned, is The Dollars and Cents of Pharmaceutical Innovation, a rather long line for a title of a talk. But we're really talking about saving lives through drug discovery. And over the next several hundred slides, well, maybe 100 slides, we'll try to go through that. And this may be something you've not heard before. Before we go through that, let me outline what I'm going to talk about today. We'll cover a brief introduction. Hopefully that will set the stage for the following parts of the talk. We'll talk about pharmaceutical math, and that's a bit of a misnomer, but after you see all the numbers and all the zeros, you'll understand why we call it pharmaceutical math. We'll talk about innovation, because the focus of the President's Cabinet and the Baker Forum this year is innovation. In fact, the focus of the world these days is innovation. But not just innovation for innovation's sake, innovation for impact. And finally, I'll do my best to tie this all back to what it means for education, particularly for Cal Poly. Now, we're talking about healthcare, so I had to start with a quote here from a doctor. This may not be the doctor you expected, but it was a doctor of life, Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss said many great things, and it seemed appropriate to start off with this one. Since those of you in the back may not be able to read, I'm going to read this quote. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. How true that is. Fortunately for Cal Poly and the students and faculty, you have for 31 years had someone who cares a whole awful lot. For those of us who have come through California's state universities, we know how important it is for setting the stage for the future, for making a difference in the future, to be part of either the student body, the faculty, or in some way contributing to this great institution in California and in the world. Thank you, President Baker, for everything you've done that's made today better and certainly paves the way for a better future. Now, for those of you who have been around since 1970, looks like most of you have, you may remember Future Shock. This is a book by Alvin Toffler that at the time was perhaps misunderstood, but he really did get it right, that the future would bring too much change in too short a period of time. He said many great things back in the 70s and became a well-known futurist. I want to draw your attention to the last two bullets on this slide. First thing he said there was that the illiterate of the future will not be the person who cannot read. That was the illiterate of the past. The illiterate of the future will be the person who does not know how to learn. And I would add to that, it's the person who does not know how to learn and do, which is the very basics of the Cal Poly education. I'll also draw your attention to the last bullet, that the next major explosion was going to have something to do with genetics and computers. And we are certainly going through that explosion today, and a few of the slides that we'll look at will describe that. Some of you may be familiar with the phrase creative destruction. This came out of a book in 2001 by Foster and Kaplan that showed that in the early 1900s, one of the large corporations, most of the large corporations, would last seemingly forever, at least a century. That lifetime has decreased. We're now talking about the life and death of corporations, major corporations, in the span of a dozen years or so. You've all heard about Moore's Law, the exponential rise in power of the computers, and of course the price coming down every second. So this is an exponential economy for sure, an exponential technology explosion. So the very old saying of standing still is going backwards, you can now append exponentially to it, and it will be quite a breeze if you're just standing and watching as this all goes by. Now, I mentioned innovation at the start, and we're going to talk a lot about innovation today. So it's only appropriate to show the dictionary definition. It's a noun, it's a new method, it's a new idea, and so on. It's derivation. But I think you can talk about innovation, think about it as the only path today to survive this creative destruction. If you want to go into it in more detail, I think the experts in the field will tell you it's many different aspects that bring together a full innovation. Part of its creation, part of its delivery, part of its customer value, but it also has to reach the marketplace. And there has to be a sustainable a sustainable business model. This can't be a flash in the pan. That's not innovation. And creativity by itself may be the start of an innovative idea, but creativity by itself that goes nowhere is not innovation. So who does the innovation today? Is it large companies? Is it small companies? Is it universities? And the answer is all of the above, even though the sizes of different corporations, as shown here, and if you don't like these companies, maybe you like Lockheed Martin or Northrop Grumman or Raytheon, some of the other very large successful corporations who have made a real difference in society today. And then look at a large nonprofit down there at the bottom, $350 million in revenues for SRI in 2008. Pales in comparison to Johnson & Johnson or Walmart. And yet there are important roles for all of these organizations and universities in innovation. Now, Big Pharma, many of you may think it wears the black hat. It often does wear the black hat. For those of us in the nonprofit world, it's nice to wear the white hat most of the time. But along with that black hat come a number of major challenges. Big Pharma today is looking at costs that are going through the roof, and it's taking them longer and longer to get a drug through to market. Productivity is going down even though the costs are going up, and there are a whole host of other challenges that they face, including our belief as a public that good health should be an entitlement. Why in the world should we have to pay for good health? This is where nonprofit organizations, NPOs, versus the for-profits or FPOs, can help in a big way. Now, if the challenges didn't seem big enough, for those of you who are familiar with this space, and I recognize that this may be a slightly different area than you're used to hearing about, think about the global challenges. Did you realize that tuberculosis infects 1 in 3 people in the world today? We're talking about more than 2 billion people infected with tuberculosis. Probably nobody in this audience. That was supposed to be a joke. But this is a very big problem, and obviously one that we need to deal with. So this is where an organization like SRI comes in, and other nonprofits. And I don't want to say too much about SRI today, but I want to put some of this in the context of nonprofit organizations like SRI or nonprofits like universities. What nonprofits can offer is a community of innovation. This is not just research for research's sake. It's research with an innovative outcome, a commercial focus. SRI itself was founded as the Stanford Research Institute, that small college north of here, founded at Stanford University in 1946. And today has about 2,000 staff members with sites around the world, more than 2,000 employees at 20 locations, and there's one nearby here in San Luis Obispo. Consolidated revenues today have grown to nearly $500 million, and we, importantly, from a healthcare standpoint, have a pipeline of new drugs, and we're saving lives every day. The founding mission of nonprofits often live with those nonprofits forever, and the very noble statement from the SRI founding in 1946 was a commitment to discovery and the application of science and technology for knowledge, commerce, prosperity, and peace, and that is still very much in everyone's mind today. In fact, we all carry it around in a card in our pocket to remind ourselves. We focus on not just interesting problems, but important problems, and sometimes people get confused and think that interesting is enough. It really isn't in today's world. And doing it all by yourself is harder and harder, so you need to do this with a team of people representing multidisciplines. And often the greatest excitement is in between the disciplines where new breakthroughs can happen. Now, having said that, I am going to focus most of the rest of this talk on biotechnology and pharmaceuticals. Before I leave SRI as an introduction, let me mention that there are a number of legacy inventions that have come out of SRI over the years. You may not realize this, but the computer mouse was invented at SRI. The standards for high-definition television were invented at SRI. One of SRI's subsidiaries, Sarnoff Corporation, you know the Emmy Award, which has been won several times by SRI. That's actually from a hand drawing in a lab notebook of the wife of one of the engineers in the original television work. And in the healthcare arena, inventions at SRI have helped to make ultrasound imaging practical, and have spun off billion-dollar corporations such as Intuitive Surgical, which is a robotic surgery company. All right, so at the end of each of the sections, I want to just touch back on some of the key points. Future shock was one of the key points here in the introduction. We talked about creative destruction and how standing still is not something you want to do. We talked about innovation, how nonprofits might play a role here, and the importance of learning and doing. Now, some of the things I say today are going to be pretty somber. So, for example, I want to make sure that everyone gets the idea of the impact of healthcare and medicine and disease. As you're listening to this today, somewhere between 50 and 100 people will die of cancer. That's not acceptable. We need to do better than that in the future. All right, let's move from the introduction to pharma math, and this will be a recurring theme. There will be a lot of numbers, and the purpose of those numbers is to try to provide context and perspective. And what you'll see is that this is a high-risk, high-payoff game. We're not just talking about dollars, we're talking about lives. In the US today, there are almost 2 million deaths every year, and 3 out of 4 of those deaths are the result of the top 12 diseases. That purple pie in the upper left, in the northwest, also includes a number of diseases. So as it turns out, more than 4 out of 5 deaths every year in the US the result of diseases. Now, despite that, the life expectancy in the US has grown dramatically over the last 100 years, from living to be 50 years old in 1910 to living to be 80 years today on average. 60% increase in the last century. And it has been estimated that 40% of that increase in life expectancy is the result of drugs that have made it to market. So if we think about this as adding 12 years of life to every person, and we have 300 million people in the United States, we're talking about adding over 3 billion years of life to the US population. Staggering figure. Unfortunately, it takes a long time to develop a drug. On average, 10 to 20 years to go from the idea, somebody's got a great idea, moving it forward to an IND, which stands for Investigational New Drug Application. It's what you file with the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, in order to start human trials. And then moving on to an NDA, the new drug application that you file to begin selling and marketing a drug. And there are lots of failures along the way. In this funnel of discovery and development, one starts with tens of thousands of drug candidates, sometimes millions of drug candidates. And what comes out the other end is a mere trickle of one drug for all of that work. As you might imagine, this is not inexpensive. Just to get one drug into human testing costs in excess of $500 million. Now, I'm going to apologize right here because occasionally with all these zeros, I get my millions and billions and trillions mixed up, but I'm sure you'll correct me if I get them wrong. Now, if that's not enough of a challenge, the costs are going up and up. The cost today to get a drug through on the market is almost 10 times what it cost in the 1970s. The latest estimates from Eli Lilly and Company are that it costs $1.8 billion to get a drug to market over 10 to 20 years. And the pharmaceutical success rate is going down. You'd think with all this spending that the opposite would be the result. But in 1996, so that's the recent past, more than 50 drugs, new drugs, went to market approved by the FDA. Last year, less than 20. Now you might say, well, why is that? Is it because the pharmaceutical companies are just raking in the profit and not reinvesting it in R&D? That's not the case. As it turns out, the reinvestment of net sales in R&D is higher than most other companies. Almost 13% for pharmaceuticals and medicines versus the all-company average of 3.5%. And to quite everyone's surprise, computers and electronics is a distant second in this chart. So today, if we look at all pharmaceutical companies, add in the biotechnology companies, we will spend about $65 billion this year on R&D. That's a very big number, as you can imagine, more than we have in our pockets for sure. And the National Institutes of Health, in the meanwhile, is losing ground. If you look back to 1980, around the time President Baker joined Cal Poly, NIH exceeded in its R&D funding all of the pharmaceutical industry. And today, all of NIH is less than half of the funding that is coming through for R&D from the pharmaceutical companies. This is not good. It means that we're going to save fewer lives in the future. Francis Collins, who is the new head of the NIH and one of the masters of the original human genome sequencing effort, recently did an analysis of the impact of NIH research from 1970 to 2000. The impact on lives saved, on improved lives, was close to $100 trillion. That's a lot of zeros. And this is a budget that is losing ground. Not a good idea. Despite all of this, miracles do happen. And occasionally a billion-dollar drug comes through, like Lipitor. Lipitor actually has reached 12 to 14 billion a year in sales, although its patent is expiring and that will drop quite rapidly. So what happens when a billion-dollar drug does make it to market? Well, let's say you're one of the innovators and you're getting a royalty. Not unusual to get a 5% royalty on a drug that makes it to market. So on a billion-dollar product, we're talking about $50 million per year. Not unusual to have 10 years of market exclusivity. So we're talking about a lot of dollars coming in to the researchers who were the inventors, to the investors who invested in that innovation. And that's why people continue to invest in pharmaceutical research. Now, given all that, you'd expect that drug prices would be really high. And that's what the media would like you to believe. It turns out the drugs are only 10 cents of every healthcare dollar. Only 10 cents. Now, as it works out in the marketplace, you pay a much higher percentage of that cost of that 10 cents than you pay for the other parts of it. But this is a really good bargain, as it turns out. And we've only scratched the surface. There's a lot more that can be done in this arena. The FDA, in all of its years, has approved a little over 1,200 drugs. It's not a lot of drugs for a century or so of regulating the drug industry. Some of that is because the old ways of doing drug discovery were slow. When I started in the industry around in the early 1980s, a really, really good medicinal chemist making new drugs would make one compound a week. Most of those drugs would be inactive, as you can tell from the funnels that I've shown you previously. And then combinatorial methods came along, and every one of those little beads or particles that you can see there next to a so-called lantern that's about the size of a pencil eraser, every one of those beads has a compound on it. And you can now readily make thousands to even millions of compounds in a single experiment. Couple that with all of the genes, less than we originally thought, but 25,000 human genes and their interplay, and it's still a big problem. But the problem is getting easier as there's an explosion of new compounds being made. Last year, we reached 50 million compounds in the Chemical Abstracts Registry, and you can see that this line is starting to go vertical. So you might think we're going to make all of the drugs and then we can stop. So how many drugs do you think are possible? The kinds of drugs that you'd put in a pill and swallow and take every morning. Okay, this is the theory. We need to put it to practice in the Cal Poly way, but this is the theory. Now that's 10 to the 60th, and you're probably wondering, how big is that number and does it really matter? I'll tell you how big that number is. It's also the same number of particles as exist in the universe today, according to theory. So in theory, we're never going to get there. There will always be another drug to make that may cure a disease that today is incurable. So that concludes the second part of what I'm going to talk about today, the pharmaceutical math. And I think many of you are familiar with the STEM concept. This used to be Better Living Through Chemistry. That was DuPont's motto for a while. There was a North Beach version of that, which some of you may remember. A certain poster with a famous young lady. But we've only just begun. And despite these long timelines and these challenges, we really can make a big difference. All right, now let's go back to the serious issues that we have to deal with. One of you today is diagnosed with cancer, and our researchers come up with a cure for that cancer today. You will die before that drug makes it to market. Regulations, complications, not wanting to hurt anyone along the way It still takes too long to develop drugs. Again, this is not acceptable. All right, now let's talk about the impact. And another title for this section of what I'm talking about today might be Why I Make Drugs for a Living. You know, in the 60s and 70s, you're at a cocktail party and somebody says, what do you do for a living? You say, I make drugs. It was really a hot topic. These days, it has less of a positive connotation, but it is still very important. And I want to play a little quote of one of my colleagues for why he works in this area.
So I talk to my friends in other fields, and they say, well, what did you do last year? And some people say, oh, well, I bought a company, or I closed an SEC transaction. And I say, well, I got a drug to the market that's going to save 2 million people a year, and most of them are children under the age of 5. And everyone goes.
Now, that shouldn't have cut off. It's wow, right? And this is what the nonprofit world can do, right? We're not so tied to what's going on Wall Street. We can do well by doing good, another old saying. And we can measure our success in terms of lives saved. Again, why is this so important? Well, it's important because every 30 seconds, a child dies of malaria. Just incredible statistics in these areas and the human impact. And if that isn't bad enough, and it's probably a little bit hard to see this, 4,000 children die from counterfeit malaria drugs every year. So people are trying to make a profit off of this terrible situation and in the process making it worse. The other number there I want you to focus on, the parents of those children who are harmed by these counterfeit drugs work over 3 million hours a year to pay for those counterfeit drugs. These are people who are making a few pennies a week, and they're putting it into what they think is the good health of their children, and their children are dying nonetheless. Big Pharma clearly was wearing the black hat for a while. 1% of R&D from Big Pharma was focused on neglected diseases like malaria from 1975 to 2000. Over the last decade, fortunately, they've done a bit more on this front, and it is hoped that they will continue to put money into this. And it's hoped that the government will continue to set policy in ways that will incentivize this kind of work. Again, nonprofit organizations, less driven by the profit motive, but in some ways more driven by making a profit because you don't have investors to go back to, you don't have students paying fees, you often don't have an endowment, so you do have to make a profit. It just doesn't have to be double-digit growth every year as it does in the commercial world. Well, SRI was one of the original groups to do work on anti-malarials, and working with the U.S. Army put a drug on the market called halofantrin, which has saved millions of lives, and is still on the market in Africa in some locations, even though it's a pretty old drug at this time. So let's shift from infectious diseases to cancer again for a moment. The World Health Organization says that this year, cancer will become the #1 killer worldwide. Now, whether it's #1 or #2 or #3, this is a lot of people dying every year. And because this is such a somber subject, I'm going to try a little attempt at humor here again, so bear with me. How many of you were more worried about the lawyer in the middle than the cancer? It usually gets a laugh. I'm glad there aren't too many lawyers in the room, or at least they're able to laugh at themselves. Nonprofits to the rescue again. Just last year, a team effort. This really is a team sport. SRI, together with Southern Research in Birmingham, Alabama, and Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York City, licensed a drug called Folletin to Allos, a biotech company in Colorado, and they managed to get FDA approval last September to treat a very serious form of lymphoma. That's now on the market. Should benefit 5,000 to 6,000 patients a year. A very significant advance. Couldn't have been done without this whole team. And the first publication from SRI on this was in 1993, approved in 2009, 16 years from start to finish. 4 organizations to get it to market. Now, the needs are going to change as society changes, as we cure some of these diseases. If we delay Alzheimer's disease by 5 or 10 years, we will have effectively cured it because the patient will die of something else. Look at the massive improvements in deaths from heart disease, from cerebrovascular diseases, so both cardiovascular in indication. But the old diseases are now posing new threats, and I want to come back to give you some perspective on some very serious diseases that you probably have heard about, like swine flu. Now, it's always dicey to point out who said some of these things, so I haven't told you the Nobel Prize winner who in 1960 said that the future of infectious disease will be very boring. So he had seen the vaccinations working, polio vaccine, quinolones, wonder drugs, which ultimately today have put on the market drugs like Cipro, which has been used against anthrax and a number of other serious infections. So he thought it was all over. Sounded an awful lot like the head of the U.S. Patent Office in 1899, who submitted his resignation to President McKinley saying, "We've invented everything we're ever going to invent. You may as well close us down." Obviously, a lot has happened since then. So what do you think happened in the 60s and 70s and so on? Well, we ran across Lassa fever and Ebola and Legionnaire's disease and hepatitis C virus, HIV/AIDS, West Nile virus, mad cow, hantavirus, SARS, bird flu, swine flu, and anthrax letters in the mail. And now we worry about pandemics like swine flu and bird flu. We worry about bioterrorism, and we worry about bugs that are resistant to everything. So this is not boring, and it really would have been nice if it had been boring. So let's put this all in context again. This is a picture from the 19-teens, 1918 Spanish flu. 500,000 people died in the US. Put it in context with World War II, where 400,000 US deaths were recorded. So 100,000 more from Spanish flu than people who died in World War II. Swine flu last year, best estimates, 80 million people were infected with swine flu. This is a picture of the virus. And if bird flu spread from me to you or you to me, the global economic impact would be $3 trillion. $3 trillion. So how big is that number? Well, remember what happened last year? A mere 700 billion. And this is going to be repaid. There's no way to repay the lives lost from a bird flu that would spread like a pandemic. So that's innovation for impact. Doing well by doing good, measuring success in lives saved. The problem when you have really bad bugs that are getting stronger and stronger. And of course, the patients can't wait. So if bird flu, H5N1, really were to spread, how many people would die? The equivalent of everyone in the states of California, Oregon, Washington, and Alaska. And we're very ill prepared for this kind of pandemic. So, that's a sad story. What does this all mean for education? And of course, no one knows, because we're preparing for the unknown. What is it that some people say that the studies that the students are working their way through today are going to be irrelevant for the jobs they hold in 10 or 20 years because of the progress of technology? But I think Cal Poly, more than almost any other institution I can think of, is very well positioned. This learn by doing concept, the partnership aspects of discovery, the cross-disciplinary aspects of what goes on here, the environmental responsibility. You have all of this together in your School of Engineering, in agriculture, in environmental design, in math and science, in the liberal arts. All of these things count in putting together a team of people, your students, your faculty, who can make a big difference in the world tomorrow. So let's go back to creative destruction, and I'm going to weave in here some of the concepts that are in the mission and the strategic plan of Cal Poly. So you'll see learning and doing a few times. The average lifetime of Standard & Poor's 500 companies, again, is going down dramatically. And already today, any drug making it to market takes more than 3 companies to get there. Today's students, I've dialed this down a bit. The estimates are actually higher than this. More than 10 jobs they will hold before their age 40. Amazing how this is going to have an impact from a future shock perspective. How can universities compete? How can nonprofits compete? Well, it turns out, at least in this recent past, we've been much more stable than the commercial world. So it really does take all types, and the number of people who I work with who have been in the same job for more than 30 years is amazing in this day and age. This will also take discipline, setting a plan, following it, so that this is not a random walk through science and technology, but something which is more of a science than an art. And so, although your assets that are most important to you are often the people you work with, it's also critical the way they work. This is a list of the so-called 5 disciplines of innovation, which was part of a top 10 Business Week Book of the Year that our CEO co-authored. And it outlines some of the critical factors that are important to think about as you're moving your way through an innovation process to market. One can also innovate at the business model level. Our branding is idea to IND, from basic ideas all the way through to starting a human clinical trial. So we start with the 5 disciplines of innovation. We do research and development, roughly break even. We make a little bit of money by providing services to government and industry. And occasionally we have a success of a drug making it to market. So yes, we are receiving royalties on Folletin, which was approved last fall, as well as a few other drugs. And to complete the cycle, never miss an opportunity to improve. You can always get better. This is a self-funding business model, as is much of education, although there are upsides and downsides to this, but a very successful model. Now, there's far too much information on this slide for you to get it all, but the point of this, turning the funnel on its side, was to show that there are many disciplines, many years, handoffs that have to happen: biology, chemistry, clinical toxicology, project management, engineering, all kinds of disciplines that have to get together in order to get a single drug through. Given the complexity, it's important to find a niche if you're a relatively small player in all of this, like a nonprofit or a single research lab under a professor. And our focus has been to bridge the so-called valley of death, to move projects from basic research through to a product candidate, and then hand it off to someone to take it to market. One also has to be very engaged and balanced in this, because most of what you do will fail. There are many people in this industry who will never get a single drug to market. What you see in the bar chart at the bottom in the red and single blue bars there, that's the cost of all the drugs that fail. These are old numbers here, 881 million to take a drug to market, but over 650 of that 881 million was the result of the drugs that failed. Those little black bars are the drugs that make it all the way through. So what's the value proposition? The value proposition for us has been to take drugs to that middle blue bar, at which point we've eliminated $500 million worth of risk. That's a pretty good value proposition. This isn't easy, though, because every one of us is unique and we change during our lifetime. So we've got 7 billion people on the planet, each with a different genome. But importantly, these are important problems, not just interesting ones, and there's room for everyone to play a role in this. So I want to touch on an example here. I'm coming close to the end of my prepared talk, but what happens if a pandemic crisis hits? You can't wait 10 to 20 years, can you? Or most of the population is going to go away. So sometimes you have to be very practical and say, what do I have on the shelf today? What prescription drugs are already there, and do they in fact work unexpectedly against this virus or that bacterium? And it turns out that some of them do. And so you need to remember that it's not always about being newer, more novel, bigger, etc. Sometimes it's just seeing the fastest way through to the solution. Last year, with swine flu about, we screened marketed drugs against H1N1, and if the well goes clear, from red to clear, you've knocked out the virus. And in fact, we did with several drugs on the market today that weren't known to have any antiviral activity. So we celebrated our success, and 5 minutes later we're back to work because there are more problems to deal with. Now I want to put one more thing in context here before I finally start to wrap up, and that is how data will overwhelm us. I put a different scale here, but the blue line is the old Moore's law, which is exponential. The red line is what's happening in the genomics arena in terms of cost and data. So we're going to be overwhelmed with data. And it's going to be important for us to be able to make all of that data into useful information and knowledge and apply it. So we need to come up with new ways to make it simple. So in healthcare terms, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. That would be probably too simple And of course, it doesn't work as easily as that, although an apple a day probably is good for you. So you have to come up with ways to bring your ideas to life, whether you're trying to explain this to someone or raise money or convince the FDA to approve your drug. I'm going to show you an animation which is about a dozen years old. One of my companies was working on mitochondria. You may know mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. We were trying to explain to bankers on Wall Street, I think this was actually Lehman Brothers, which is no longer there, how mitochondria and the powerhouse of the cell might be important for disease, and they just weren't getting it. So we went back to our hotel room in New York one night, and we put all of our PowerPoint skills together in order to come up with an animation. And this was state-of-the-art for us at the time. And it went something like this. Here's a cell. Inside the cell, you have hundreds to thousands of mitochondria. Later tonight, you're going to eat. That's going to provide fuel to the cell. Inside the cell, inside the mitochondrion, there will be 4 complexes of proteins that pass the nutrients and electrons down a chain of proteins. And they charge up the world's smallest rotary engine, an enzyme known as ATP synthase. ATP synthase, spinning in the right direction, creates ATP and charges what is effectively a battery, the mitochondria. Unfortunately, in diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, the battery can spin in the other direction, and it effectively creates blackouts or brownouts in the brain. And that's what Parkinson's and Alzheimer's are all about, and that's why mitochondria are important. Finally, the light bulbs went off in the investment bankers' minds, and we managed to get a financing done and move the programs forward. Now, this is a very simple example, but bringing it to life is so critical. And a picture really is worth a lot of words. I don't know how many words, but this is an image, a micrograph of mitochondrion and some computer drawings that came from that and some higher resolution pictures of the proteins. One last video, bringing new technologies to life.
In trauma surgery, people talk about the golden hour, which is that when patients have critical injuries, that you have an hour to intervene in these critical injuries. And in that hour, if you don't get those life-saving interventions taken care of, then you lose patients.
Scanning.
You can get more interventions in that golden hour without endangering your specialist surgeon and save more soldiers' lives. And I think that's their motivation, is to get more interventions further forward. Robotic surgery now is largely isolated to certain minimally invasive operations where the robot offers some dexterity and degrees of freedom of motion with instruments that
I'm going to stop that there. Clearly, there are some things that drugs can't do. And this is where some of these types of technologies come in. This was a project that was a collaboration of several government agencies and more than a dozen companies and universities to create a trauma pod that could be dropped into a remote region of Montana or Iraq or anywhere where you needed care, perhaps Hurricane Katrina, in order to deliver high-quality surgical and other medical care where you couldn't otherwise, in that golden hour when you can really save lives. Well, so where is Cal Poly in all of this? I think it's dealing remarkably well with future shock and is doing all of the right things, and that's important because we're counting on you. Without you, the world is not going to be as good a place as we'd all like it to be, and I'll use the hard C pre-Cicero, discere faciet, which is the Latin for learn and do. That is a very important part of the education here. I know it will evolve over time, but please don't lose that as you move forward with your strategic plan. With that, remember, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Walter, thank you so much for sobering, riveting, and hopefully very inspirational, particularly for the younger folks out here, presentation on the dollars and cents of the pharmaceutical innovation. I'm going to open it up for questions. I have one or two myself. Actually, I have about 10 here because I was jotting them down even more as you were giving
I've been writing down the answers, Steve. I'm all set.
I knew you were smart, but I didn't know you were that smart. So let me start off with a rather provocative one on, for example, Pfizer. We've heard this phrase all too often, all too big to fail. So are any big pharmas such as Pfizer or some of these others, are they just too big to fail that somehow the government or somebody else will have to keep them propped up?
That's a good question, Steve. And I don't think any big pharma is too big to fail. So why is that? Because Pfizer makes $40, $50 billion a year, has a valuation of something north of $100 billion a year. But we have an industry around Pfizer to take the pieces and perhaps make them even more productive. You know, what happens when you have a large organization that ends up with 100,000 people, it's very difficult to manage, whereas a small company focused on one element can make a really big difference. A venture capital firm, and this has happened now a number of times, can take pieces out of pharmaceutical companies and turn them into companies that are worth what the entire pharmaceutical company was before, take diamonds in the rough and really buff them up. So unlike the financial industry, I think we might end up better if we broke up some of these big companies in the pharmaceutical arena.
Okay. Another question on, I want to follow up on your terrible bug got loose and $3 trillion in economic impact and tens of millions of dollars dead and so forth. And that's the really sobering part for me as I was listening to you. Could you expand on that a little bit more? What would you do if you're declared king of the universe to forestall such a situation?
You know, I applied for that job and I wasn't... I think President Baker was pretty close to that, though, right? All right, so a bad bug gets out. What happens? So you know what happened with swine flu last year, right? We didn't do particularly well. You know, when an oil company starts to have a fire and there's smoke in the air and it's toxic, you shelter in place. That's a heck of a way to run a country. So I think there are a number of flaws with the current system. One is that there's no single person or agency in charge of this at the government level. NIH does its stuff, and of course they have these committees. You can't manage this kind of stuff by committee, right? I mean, it would take too long. People would be dying while they'd be managing this. You've got BARDA, you've got the Homeland Security, you've got DTRA, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, you've got the Army, you've got the Navy. All of these groups have their own functions, and they're not coordinated in a way that would really make this an emergency team to make a difference. Then I think one of the things you shouldn't do, which we've already done, is put all of the manufacturing offshore. So what happens if we need ciprofloxacin and all of it is made in China, and China needs all of it for its population? So I think there are some missteps that the government and the companies have made in trying to deal with some of these issues. But there are things you can do. Break it down into phases. You need certain drugs to boost the immune system. You need certain ways to deal with things for the early responders, and there are some drugs that you can stockpile for that. We've started to do the stockpiling, but not enough. It's going to take more money. Secondly, you need something that's going to work in the midterm. Probably some sort of antibody project, polyclonals, which went out of favor, but they would work because poly means they work against a whole bunch of things. And then you need all of the drugs ready to be tested to see if they might unexpectedly work against a drug. And there's an old Woody Allen quote that says 80% of life is showing up, and it turns out that for drugs, that's often the case, that the drugs that are on the market are safe enough and they actually get to parts of the body that are relevant. And so they're there, see if they work, and you'd be amazed how many of them work because they're effectively selective toxins. And you need to knock out the bug before the patient dies.
So let me turn to the audience. Yes, in front here.
30 years ago, drugs were eliminated at phase 1 or phase 2 of drug discovery and development. Now we're seeing that actually phase 3 and actually post-marketing phase 4 are places where drugs are already on the market, and then they're having to have all of this development money go down the drain because of public response to various fears. what can be done to, first of all, try to avoid the phase 3, phase 4 problem? And then what can be done with the public to become, help them become more educated as to what some of these very low probability side effects are and relative risk?
Great question. You didn't tell me there were going to be ringers in the audience.
Oh, we've got some very smart people around Cal Poly.
Well, so, you work for 20 years, you've got a $1 billion product on the market, and then Vioxx happens, or some of the more recent diabetes drugs. How do you avoid that? This is a big problem because just to study 10,000 patients is a huge, very expensive clinical trial. It can cost $50,000, $100,000 per patient. And every one of us is unique. So, you've got a bell curve, and for whatever population those 10,000 patients, and it's usually more like 1,000 or 2, have been studied, then you're not going to have the side effects that you would be surprised by. But there are always going to be outliers, and there's no way to sample that whole population. So there are several approaches that have been proposed, none of them accepted yet. But one of the approaches at the Critical Path Institute, which is a new nonprofit in Tucson, Arizona, that we helped to co-found with the FDA, proposed, was that we actually release in phase 2, but to a very well-defined population. And we hire more pharmacy technicians who follow up with their local population, and they're calling up your grandmother and saying, "How you feeling today? Anything different?" And they see them in the community, and they're right there for early warning signs. And you don't launch with the idea that you're going to make a $1 billion drug. You launch with the idea that you're going to treat a very restricted population in a location that you can control, and you're going to watch vigilantly for side effects that might be something serious. And you roll it out very slowly. If you do that, you're going to hurt fewer patients. Of course, the other part of this is using biomarkers. Biomarkers are relatively new. It's hard to get this all to work the right way, so it's very new science. But I think ultimately, patients will be selected based on some analysis of their genes and their blood, or some other technique that comes up to say, okay, this patient is likely to react well to this drug, not going to have a problem with one of the other drugs that we're working on, and so it's a good patient. And the ideal is that you pick the patients for the clinical trial who will all show the positive effect up front, none of whom will show the side effects based on these biomarkers, a much less expensive trial, do it much faster, and then again, be very careful in rolling the drug out, because I don't think you can get around the numbers problem. Now, you asked another question, which is how we educate people. Hopefully, the slides that I showed today was something of an education. We are teaching more and more in universities about pharmaceutical research and development, and we found that most people really don't have a clue about the impact on lives or the timelines. How is an 18-year-old kid going to think about a 20-year timeline for a drug? It's very hard for them to comprehend that. So we are reaching out a bit more on that front. And the other thing I'll say is that you need to bring it to life. Many times, scientists, technical people get so buried in their own technical aspects, they can't communicate it well to the public. And converse, the more STEM education that happens, the more educated the public will be so that they will understand this, and maybe we can meet in the middle.
Thank you. Jaime?
I turned 79 this February.
Congratulations.
Maybe it's tied into being married 53 years. The thing I noticed on the swine flu was that they said if you're older, you probably are in better shape not to take the pill than if you're younger. That's one part. The other part is you say, how are you doing? And you say, I'm doing fine. How long did your dad last? How long did your mom last? And your grandparents? And well, they all died in the late 90s. Have they looked into when you're in the crunch and you got to have X number of pills to cure, that you can, by having a data bank on people in some fashion that won't be judged to be intrusive in today's world, to say, well, you know, we only need 100 pills to get the ones that we know are really in trouble versus 500 pills to cover everybody, even the ones that it's probably not going to do much for them because they won't get it. And the last question that I have for you, what are your career goals when you reach 30?
You can take those in reverse order if you'd like.
So I'm old enough that I can't remember age 30. The triage, I'm not sure what you meant by that question, so we can come back to it, but the triaging does go on. People look at based on what they know at the time, whether a patient is likely to progress. And people figured out pretty quickly that it was the younger population who was more at risk and needed to be treated aggressively, setting aside the very young children and infants who might be harmed by the antiviral drugs. But what's now been shown is that people who were around in the late 50s or the late 60s and had the Hong Kong or the Asian flu or were at least exposed to it do have some natural immunity to something that looks enough like the swine flu that the older population wasn't hit as hard and the younger population was. So I think that's part of the story there. And they had to triage because they didn't have enough drugs. They had to triage because they didn't have enough of the vaccines. And so decisions were made. There were protocols set up for, nice little flow charts that said, age and status. They looked at respiratory function to see if the patient was likely to progress to pneumonia, because many of the patients who died ended up with a bacterial superinfection on top of the viral infection. So that was all done, probably not as well as it could have been, but it was certainly part of it. Now, did I answer your questions? The genetics part. So for many decades, I don't know when this started, doctors have been taking patient histories. And the really good doctors have this all written down, and they're thinking about that as they're looking at you. But you need to have a doctor who knows you, who's done a full medical history, and they have all that information there if they have. And it'd be very hard if you're walking into some clinic and they don't know you from Adam, and there's no electronic health record that they can draw in. What's that commercial with an audience like this, and somebody's on stage talking to his physician, and you have all of the audience as doctors, and the physician is asking questions, and the doctors in the audience are answering. Of course, this guy's in one of these half gowns saying, "Can I have my pants back?" So that information is there. It makes sense to have a close relationship with a physician or with physicians who know your medical history, who know your parents, your siblings, and have that all there, because then they can also watch out for you and say, if you've got heart disease, then they're probably going to want to keep your blood pressure down. They're probably going to want to put you on a statin to keep your lipids regulated, even if they're not terribly high. This is something that the physicians actually do a pretty good job of.
So Walter, your industry is one of the most heavily regulated industries, and the name of the group is the FDA, which we've touched upon a little bit. What do you think about the FDA? Is the FDA the problem, or can we see some alterations or modifications of the FDA and some of its processes, or some other agency that could help reduce the cost of drugs, the more effective drugs, and the time to market of drugs?
Wow. Do I have another hour? This is the FDA.
We'll stay.
There are a lot of good people at the FDA. There are a lot of good people at the EMA, which is the European equivalent. And they're doing the best they can. Some of them are quite good. Janet Woodcock, who's been with the Center for Drugs Evaluation, has been there for a long time, and she really knows what she's doing. But they have a number of limitations. For example, they can't get companies together because of antitrust. And this is, again, where a nonprofit, or whether it's like SRI or university, can help. And we did this with the Critical Path Institute that I mentioned earlier. We created a neutral ground where companies could share data and samples, and the FDA could come in and look at it. And we took markers for kidney toxicity, which is often a problem with cancer drugs. Today, by the time you can see kidney toxicity with normal methods, it's too late. The damage is irreparable. But by sharing samples, sharing data, we were able to come up with a new test that works in 24 hours, and not the month it would take with other approaches. So you create this neutral ground, a public-private partnership, and that helps you go through the process much more quickly and effectively. But there's another big issue, which often government policies hurt us. You know, and we were talking about this a little bit earlier before the talk, that often we're guilty until proved innocent, and we're regulated based on a punishment model. Now, most people I know in this industry are trying to do the right thing, and they respond much better to incentives, pat on the back, or policy that says, okay, this is going to make your industry more stable, or I'm going to incentivize you to take a neglected disease drug to market, and the incentive is several $100 million. Now, that's a big incentive, and it's a carrot as opposed to a stick. And then we have to get out of this crazy notion that everybody in this industry, the physicians are bad, and they've got a conflict of interest because they consulted for this company over here. Because what we end up with is panels looking at a new drug, and these people don't know the disease. You know, how would you like to be going in to work with a heart surgeon, and he's using a drug where nobody who had ever had any cardiovascular training reviewed that drug and approved it? So what you need are the best people, the most experienced people, regardless of who they worked with or for, looking at the product. You need enough of them across sections so that if there is one bad apple, you're going to be able to sort that out. But don't you want the smartest people looking at whether this drug gets on the market and you might take it tomorrow?
Time for one or two more questions? Yes.
In manufacturing, there's a concept called mass customization, which is to come up with a set of products that deal specifically with the needs of a particular customer because it's based on a common platform. I wonder if there's a similar movement to come up with drug products that are customized to specific characteristics of individuals.
Yes, Dave, you're right on target. The personalized medicine movement is strong afoot, and it will take a long time, but people are working on personalizing the medicine. And my analogy is you go into a paint store and you like a certain color, and they're going to dip a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and it's going to be reproducible and it's going to work for you. It may not be the same for everybody else. Now, interestingly, Paul Janssen, one of the legendary figures in medicine, who was from Belgium, ended up being part of Johnson & Johnson, he did this experimentally as a pharmacologist. He took drugs that were so-called dirty drugs. They did different things to different levels, and he studied them in people and came up with those dirty drugs that had the right mix of effects for this patient population and a slightly different mix for this patient population. So we've already shown that this works. We just haven't done it in a reproducible platform way where, as you say in manufacturing, you've got the platform. We've shown the proof of concept, and people are now moving to have enough information so that they can do it over and over again.
Let me provide one more final question. Oh, you have one here? Great.
Dr. Moos, thank you very much for a message that is very encouraging to our students. Unfortunately, there aren't as many of them here as we would have liked to have seen. Let me pose a question to you that is more of a moral dilemma for the pharmaceutical companies, and it resonates well with some of the statistics you presented. You indicated the example of some poor people in poorer parts of the world where some of their monies go and they are directed at drugs that are not the real thing. But there's a different dilemma, and that is when drugs are developed, they are expensive. For example, we have Avastin, a wonder drug which costs tens of thousands of dollars even in the United States. How can drugs like that be made available to those who can least afford it around the world? We certainly see commendable examples from the Bill and Melinda Foundation who are targeting billions of their funds to do just that. Can the pharmaceutical companies do more than what they apparently seem to be doing at this time? Certainly there are problems because the huge investments have to be returned. But on a global scale, what do you see as a possible solution where pharmaceutical companies perhaps can do more than they apparently seem to do at this time?
Well, provided we can keep, and this may be controversial, provided we can keep our borders closed to reimportation of drugs, pharmaceutical companies should give away more of those drugs in communities that can't ever afford to pay for them. And the government needs more incentives like one of its recent acts that was passed, which provides a voucher for any company who takes a neglected disease drug to market. And that voucher is good for fast-track status on their next drug. What that amounts to in value is several $100 million. And the math is pretty simple. If you've got a drug that sells $365 million a day, that's $1 million. That's $365 million a year. That's $1 million a day. And so for every day you lose in getting a drug to market, you're losing $1 million, right? So by providing these vouchers to fast-track the next drug through, they've got a very significant head start on it. So again, carrots, not sticks, and appropriate limitations in what other countries might do to harm the pharmaceutical innovation here in order to allow them to be more generous in the future. Very good question, because, you know, the whole cost of the drug might be more than the entire village makes in some parts of the world.
Well, Dr. Moos, Walter, thank you so much for spending time with us and explaining all the interesting things about dollars and cents in the pharmaceutical industry and about innovation. Your insights are well received by this audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Good job. Really good job.
If you could all remain for a minute. I know Dr. Baker has been thinking about his next career, and he's been furiously taking lots of notes around the biochemistry that Dr. Moos has been describing here today. But he's back here with us, and he'd like to present a special gift to Dr. Moos. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Moos, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation that you made today on a complex, important, and often misunderstood part of the world healthcare system. You answered some questions that even came up in our meeting today about what you do with a bioscience degree. I mean, thank you very much, and I'd like to give you this as a small token of our appreciation. We know that we've recorded this, and this will be available to our students, and I'm sure that it will be an incentive for a lot of them to think more deeply about these issues. This is a history of Cal Poly learned by doing.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Wonderful presentation. This is terrific.
Good job.
Well, thank you, everyone. That concludes this afternoon session for the Baker Forum. For those of you who are in the cabinet, we'll see you a little bit later on tonight for dinner and tomorrow as well. Thank you again for attending.
This is terrific.